The morning it happened, Evelyn Hargrove stepped out of her black Bentley and looked at the sign above the door, Callaway Repair and Machining, and laughed. Not a loud laugh, a soft one. The kind that slides out between polished lips without apology. The kind meant to be heard by the people standing closest. Her entourage heard it, her driver heard it. The two managers flanking her heard it and looked away, because that was the appropriate response when their CEO found something beneath her. She did not know that the man inside, the one wiping his hands on a grease-darkened cloth behind a steel workbench, held 7 patents that 3 of her production lines ran on every single day. She did not know that the quiet of his shop was not the quiet of small ambitions. It was the quiet of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. She had just made the most expensive mistake of her professional life, and she was still smiling when she walked through the door. If this story sounds like something you need to hear to the end, stay with it. Every detail was placed there for a reason. The shop existed at the edge of an industrial block in a mid-sized city that had been growing in all the wrong directions for 20 years. The building was narrow. The exterior paint had gone gray and peeling, and the hand-lettered sign above the entrance had rusted at the corners in a way that made it look older than it was. But inside, the space was different. Every tool hung in its designated place on a pegboard wall, outlined in faint marker so nothing was ever returned to the wrong hook. The workbenches were clear, except for the active job. The floor was swept each morning before the first customer arrived, even when no customers were expected. The order of the place said something about the man who maintained it, though very few visitors ever paused long enough to read that message. Mason Callaway was 39 years old, and he had been running this shop for just under 4 years, since the lease on a larger space had ended, and he had decided, quietly and without announcement, that smaller was what he needed right now. He had a daughter named Bonnie who was 6, missing one front tooth, and fiercely loyal to a stuffed rabbit named Cotton, who lived on the corner of Mason's workbench during school hours. Mason dropped her at the neighbor's house each morning at 7:45 and picked her up at 5. In between, he worked. What most people in the neighborhood did not know because Mason had never told them, and the information was not on any visible surface, was that he had spent 11 years before the shop as a lead systems engineer at Vantex Engineering Group, one of the more respected industrial automation firms on the East Coast. He had designed production line control systems for manufacturers in 7 states. He had filed 7 patents during those years, all under his own name per his contract, all related to precision automation and cascade failure prevention in industrial machinery. 3 of those patents had been licensed to major manufacturers through Vantex's IP division, and the royalty payments deposited into his account each quarter were modest but reliable. Mason had left Vantex not because the work dried up, not because he was pushed out, but because his wife, Claire, had died of a fast-moving illness when Bonnie was 18 months old, and someone had to be home. He had made that choice with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. He did not grieve it publicly. He did not speak about his former career unless directly asked, and almost no one directly asked. His friend Adrian Cole, who had known him since their first year of college and now ran a small investment fund across town, asked about it regularly. Mason's answer was always the same deflection, a slight turn of the head, a return to whatever was in his hands. Adrian understood that the conversation would happen when Mason was ready for it to happen, and not before. The one thing that kept Mason's name alive in industrial circles without his name ever actually appearing was his reputation for fixing what others could not. Word moved slowly in that world, from plant manager to plant manager, from maintenance supervisor to shift foreman, and the word was simple. If a machine stopped working and no one else could bring it back, call the man at Callaway Repair. He did not advertise. He did not have a website beyond a single-page listing with a phone number. He charged fairly. He never failed to deliver. Each evening after Bonnie was asleep and the house was quiet, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and whatever technical documentation he was working through, keeping his knowledge current. In the same disciplined way, he kept his tools organized. He was not waiting for anything, but he was ready. The call that changed the trajectory of everything came on a gray Tuesday morning in early October. It did not come to Mason first. It came to a man named Jason Merritt, the the chief financial officer of Hargrove Industrial, who received it from the plant manager of the company's second manufacturing facility at 6:52 in the morning. The message was direct and alarming. The primary CNC production line had gone down overnight. A cascade fault had propagated through the control board, the entire system was frozen, and the technical team on site had been unable to isolate the source for 3 hours. Hargrove Industrial was a precision metal components manufacturer, the third largest in the northeastern United States by revenue, and the second facility was currently under contract to supply a defense subcontractor with a delivery deadline 48 hours away. Jason Merritt called 2 national maintenance contractors before 8 in the morning and received the same answer from both. They could send a team in 72 hours. He called the original equipment manufacturer's service line and was placed on hold. He called Evelyn Hargrove's direct line at 8:20 and told her the situation with the careful verbal framing of a man who had long since learned how to present bad news in the least damaging shape possible. Evelyn listened, said 4 words, "Fix it by noon," and ended the call. Jason's fourth call was to the plant manager who had originally reported the failure, a veteran named Walt Garber, who had been running that facility for 22 years, and who responded to Jason's escalating frustration with a flat Midwestern calm. Walt said he knew one person who might be able to help. He said he couldn't guarantee it. He said the person in question ran a small shop and might not take the call. Jason said to give him the number anyway. Walt gave it to him and added, before hanging up, that this particular person had once diagnosed a cascade fault in under 4 minutes, that a certified systems team had spent 2 days misidentifying. Jason Merritt wrote the number down, skeptical, and dialed it. Mason answered on the 3rd ring. He was already at the workbench. The call lasted 4 minutes. Mason asked which generation of control board, what the ambient temperature in the facility had been the previous night, and whether the fault codes were showing in sequence or simultaneously. Jason answered all 3. Mason was quiet for several seconds after the 3rd answer. The kind of silence that comes from rapid internal calculation rather than uncertainty. Then he said he would come. He asked for the address. He did not ask about the fee, and Jason, flustered, forgot to mention it. Mason hung up, set the phone face down on the bench, and began packing his secondary kit with the methodical efficiency of someone who already knew what he was walking into. He left cotton on the workbench for Bonnie. He left a note on the door. He drove his 11-year-old pickup truck across the city and arrived at Hargrove's second facility at 9:40. The facility was large, clean, and surrounded by a fleet of leased vehicles that collectively cost more than Mason's shop. A group of people were standing in the parking lot near the entrance when he pulled in Evelyn Hargrove among them, in a charcoal coat, phone in one hand, the other hand raised to shade her eyes as she assessed the arriving truck. Mason stepped out. He was wearing dark work pants, a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his older boots. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder. He looked at the building first, then at the group. Evelyn Hargrove looked at him the way certain people look at things that arrive in an unexpected package, with a brief, visible recalibration that ends not in openness, but in revised condescension. Her assistant, Kara Whitfield, stood 2 steps behind her and said nothing. Mason nodded in the direction of the general group. No one nodded back. He followed Walt Garber inside. What happened in the next 2 hours and 20 minutes was witnessed only by Walt and the 2 floor technicians who had been asked to remain nearby in case Mason needed assistance. He did not need assistance. He worked through the control cabinet systematically, his movements unhurried, his focus absolute. He did not speak except once, to ask for a specific diagnostic cable that Walt retrieved from a side cabinet. He did not consult documentation, which Walt found remarkable given that the system was a proprietary configuration from nearly a decade earlier. At 11:47, the production line restarted. The cascade fault had been a secondary ground loop failure, masking a corrupted initialization sequence, a problem that the original equipment manufacturer's remote diagnostics would likely have taken 2 additional days to correctly identify. Walt stood at the edge of the floor and watched the first components move through the line with the measured satisfaction of a man who had seen a great many things go wrong in this building and not nearly enough go right. Mason packed his tools. He walked out of the facility and back into the main corridor where Evelyn was waiting with Jason Merritt and two of the operations managers. She was already on her phone again. When Mason appeared, she ended the call and said, with the brisk efficiency of someone settling an invoice, "How much?" Mason gave her the number. It was a fair rate, not inflated, not discounted. Evelyn didn't look up when she instructed Jason to process the payment. Jason, looking at Mason with the poorly concealed amusement of a man who considers himself to have successfully managed a minor inconvenience, said to the room in general that it was a good thing they had found someone, and wasn't it convenient that the small shop rate was so much easier on the quarterly budget than the contract firms? One of the managers smiled. Another looked at the floor. Jason kept talking, something about operational cost management, and the phrase small operation came out of his mouth twice in 30 seconds, each time with the same slight inflection that distinguished it from a neutral description and made it something else entirely. Evelyn did not stop him. She was already scrolling through her phone. Kara, standing behind Evelyn, looked at the far wall with a careful blankness that Mason recognized as the expression of someone who was embarrassed by what they were witnessing, but did not have the standing to interrupt it. Mason did not respond to Jason. He did not look at Evelyn for a reaction. He zipped his bag closed in the same unhurried way he had opened it and settled the strap on his shoulder. Evelyn looked up briefly and said, with a finality that was almost gracious in its efficiency, "Thank you for coming on short notice. If we have smaller issues in the future, we'll be in touch." The word smaller landed in the room and sat there. Mason looked at her directly for the first time that day, and there was nothing in his expression that she could use no offense, no anger, no plea for recognition. He looked at her the way a person looks at a system they are studying, noting its properties without judgment. He said it was no problem. Then he walked out. Walt Garber caught up with him near the exit, reached out and shook his hand with both of his own, and said quietly that the control system Mason had just repaired was originally designed by a Vantex team about 9 years back. Said he had been there when it was installed, and he'd never seen anyone outside the original team work on it without documentation. He said he didn't know if Mason knew the system from somewhere, but whatever the case, he was grateful. Mason thanked him without elaborating. He walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, without starting the engine, looking through the windshield at the clean industrial facade of the building that bore the name Hargrove on a brushed steel plate beside the entrance. His face was still. His hands were still. Then he reached into the center console and pulled out a manila folder he had not opened in more than 2 years. It contained a document from his Vantex period, a consulting report he had been commissioned to write on the rehabilitation potential of an older Hargrove facility. He looked at the cover page for a moment. Then he put the folder back, started the truck, and drove to pick up Bonnie. Adrian came over that evening with a six-pack and no particular agenda, which was his way of saying he knew something had happened and he was available if Mason wanted to talk. They sat at the kitchen table after Bonnie was in bed, and Mason laid out the day without editorializing. The visit, the repair, the payment, the comments from Jason Merritt. Adrian listened to all of it, and then asked the question he had been quietly forming since the first sentence. "What are you thinking about?" Mason said he was thinking about the Westbrook facility. Adrian set down his bottle. The Westbrook facility was the third manufacturing plant in the Hargrove portfolio, a property that Evelyn Hargrove had shuttered 14 months ago on grounds of operational inefficiency. It sat on 12 acres in a neighborhood called Westbrook, about 6 miles from where they were sitting now. The machinery inside was old, the building itself was mid-century industrial, and the whole property had been carrying a for-sale listing for 9 months with no takers because of its reputation as a money pit. Adrian knew all of this because Mason had mentioned it once before, months ago, in a context that had not seemed important at the time. Now, hearing Mason say the name again in that tone, Adrian understood that it had been important all along. What Adrian did not know in that moment, what Mason told him over the next hour, was the full shape of what existed inside Westbrook and why the conventional wisdom about it was wrong. Mason had been inside that facility 5 years earlier, during his consulting period, when Hargrove's previous management had commissioned a rehabilitation study before Evelyn took the helm. He had spent 3 days there with a small technical team and he had written a detailed report concluding that 70% of the installed equipment was recoverable with targeted investment, and that the production capacity, if properly upgraded, would outperform either of Hargrove's active facilities at a significantly lower per-unit cost. That report had been submitted, received, and, as Mason had later learned, forwarded by Evelyn to Jason Merritt to be handled. It had not been acted on. The facility had been closed instead. Mason knew the report had gone into a drawer because he had followed up once, professionally, and received a form response. He had not followed up again. But he had not forgotten what he had seen inside that building, and he had not forgotten the specific equipment configurations, the infrastructure layout, or the particular capabilities that could be unlocked if someone who understood the underlying systems was willing to do the engineering work. Someone who had, as it happened, designed several of the control systems that would integrate with that equipment. Someone who held the patents. Adrian asked one question. He asked how long. Mason said 18 months from acquisition to first production. Adrian sat with that for a moment. The way a person sits with a number they are checking against their internal confidence register. Then he said he was in. He did not ask about projected returns. He did not ask about risk. He asked when Mason wanted to start the legal process. Mason said tomorrow. The legal contact was a property attorney named David Keene, a careful man with an office that smelled of old books, who had handled Mason's patent agreements during the Vantex years and who received Mason's call the following morning with measured surprise. Mason asked about the current ownership status and listing terms for the Westbrook property. David said he would look into it and call back by end of day. He called back in 4 hours. The asking price was lower than Mason had expected, not dramatically lower, but low enough that the number felt like a door being held open. The property had been sitting long enough that Hargrove's board had apparently authorized Jason Merritt to accept any reasonable offer, rather than continue carrying the asset on a balance sheet that was already drawing attention, heading into the annual audit. David said there was no indication that the seller was scrutinizing buyers beyond standard financial qualification. Mason said to draft the offer. He sat with the numbers that evening and ran them 3 times. Not because he doubted his engineering estimate, but because discipline required it. The capital Adrian was committing covered acquisition, initial rehabilitation, and 14 months of operating runway before the first production revenue arrived. It was tight. It was not impossible. Mason had worked with tighter tolerances than that for most of his career, and the principle was the same. Precision mattered more than margin, and patience mattered more than speed. He drove to Westbrook on a Thursday afternoon while Bonnie was at school, arriving in a light rain that turned the old building's brick exterior a deep rust color. The facility had been locked and dark for more than a year, and the loading bay doors wore chains with padlocks, but Mason had arranged temporary access through David's office. He walked through the entire floor space over the course of 4 hours, moving through each section with the slow attention of someone reading a language they knew fluently. He checked structural connections, examined motor housings, assessed conduit runs, tested manual overrides on the equipment where they existed. He did not take notes because he did not need to. Everything he needed was already organized in his memory, in the way that certain minds organize things they have decided to care about permanently. By the time he walked back out into the rain, he had revised his 18-month estimate down to 15. The building had aged well in the ways that mattered, and poorly in the ways that were correctable. The purchase closed on a quiet Friday morning. No press release, no announcement. The acquiring entity was Callaway Industrial LLC, a company that had been registered 3 weeks prior with Adrian as co-owner and Mason as managing director. The filing was public record, available to anyone who searched for it, but no one who worked at Hargrove Industrial had reason to search for it, and the name Callaway, appearing in a routine commercial property transaction, carried no flag. Jason Merritt signed the transfer documentation during a meeting he had scheduled for 30 minutes, and which he spent largely reviewing his phone. The former Hargrove employees who had been laid off when Westbrook closed were not informed of the sale, though several of them would learn of it soon enough through channels that did not require an announcement. In the weeks after the acquisition, Mason worked quietly through the hiring process, reaching out through Walt Garber's network and through former Vantex contacts to find people with the specific skills the Westbrook operation would need. He did not post listings publicly. He called people directly, explained the project plainly, and offered a wage that was fair without being extraordinary. What drew people in was not the money, but the nature of the offer itself. A chance to work on something being built from the ground up by someone who knew exactly what he was building and why. Among the first 15 hires were 6 former Westbrook employees who had been cut when Evelyn closed the facility. They knew the building. They knew the equipment. They showed up on the first day of interior work with a focused energy that Mason recognized and respected. He did not give a speech. He showed them what they were going to build, answered their questions directly, and then they began. There was a particular satisfaction in watching those 6 people walk back through a door that had been closed on them, carrying tool bags and wearing the same work boots they had worn before the layoff, returning not with bitterness, but with the specific determination of workers who understood the value of what they were being given. Mason registered that satisfaction and set it aside. There was too much work ahead for sentiment to occupy much space. While Mason built, Hargrove Industrial entered a period of compounding friction that its leadership was slow to accurately diagnose. A defense subcontract that had been expected to renew did not renew. The contracting agency, citing concerns about delivery reliability in their evaluation notes. A second client reduced its order volume without formal explanation. Evelyn received these signals through Jason Merritt's reporting, which framed each setback as an isolated market fluctuation rather than a systemic pattern. The quality control issues that were generating the underlying client dissatisfaction had been accumulating across Hargrove's active facilities for nearly 2 years, the result of deferred maintenance and staffing reductions that had followed Evelyn's restructuring program. The program had improved short-term margins and damaged long-term capability, a trade-off that was common and that experienced operations people recognized immediately. Evelyn was experienced in capital strategy and market positioning. She was less experienced in the floor-level mechanics of production quality, and the people around her who understood those mechanics had been filtered out through several rounds of performance review that rewarded financial fluency over operational knowledge. Kara Whitfield was one of the people who understood something was wrong before it appeared in the numbers. She had been Evelyn's executive assistant for 4 years, a role that gave her access to correspondence, meeting summaries, and client communications that presented the full picture rather than the curated version that moved up the reporting chain. She had written a memo 9 months earlier, carefully worded, outlining the pattern she was seeing in client feedback and maintenance request frequency. Evelyn had read it, marked it, and forwarded it to Jason with instructions to review. Kara had not received a response and had not been invited to discuss it further. She had continued doing her job and watching. It was during this period of watching that she first noticed the Callaway Industrial name in a transaction summary she processed as part of the routine paperwork that crossed her desk. The name meant nothing to her in that moment. She logged it and moved on. The Callaway Industrial operation at Westbrook reached what Mason called first production, meaning the line was running clean at sustainable volume in the 14th month after acquisition, 1 month ahead of schedule. The initial product was a category of precision-machined aerospace component that fell within a specification range that very few North American manufacturers could reliably meet. Mason had designed the production process to hit that specification consistently using a control system integration that reflected both his engineering background and the specific capabilities of the Westbrook equipment, updated and modified by his own hand. The tolerance margin on the first production run was 15% tighter than the published industry standard. Adrian, who was present for the first full shift, said nothing for a long time after reviewing the quality report. Then he said that they were going to have more work than they could schedule within 6 months. Mason said he knew. The first commercial contract came from a mid-tier defense subcontractor that had, 14 months earlier, been a Hargrove Industrial client. They had left Hargrove after the delivery failure and spent the intervening period working with a less capable supplier while quietly monitoring the market for something better. They received a brief technical summary about Callaway Industrial through a mutual contact in the industry, ordered a small evaluation batch, and received it on the scheduled date with documentation that exceeded their internal quality benchmarks. They sent a contract inquiry the following week. Mason's legal team reviewed it, made 2 adjustments, and returned it signed. The relationship was not announced. In the world of precision manufacturing, the deals that mattered most were almost never announced. By the 16th month, Callaway Industrial had 3 active production contracts and a 4th under negotiation with a Japanese automotive supplier that had been searching for a North American partner capable of meeting their exacting dimensional standards. The conversation with the Japanese team had been initiated through an intermediary and conducted with the measured patience of 2 parties, who both understood that the right agreement was worth waiting for. When the contract was finalized, the annual value was larger than Hargrove Industrial's total revenue from the previous quarter. The news appeared in a trade publication, briefly, in a single paragraph that named Callaway Industrial and described it as an emerging precision components manufacturer based in Westbrook. There was no photograph of Mason Callaway. There was no background on the company's founding. There was only the name, the location, and the number. Jason Merritt read the paragraph at his desk and felt the temperature of the room change around him in a way that had nothing to do with the climate control system. He did a transaction search on Callaway Industrial LLC and found the property record for the Westbrook acquisition. He sat with that for a long time. He ran the numbers on what Westbrook's current production capacity was likely to be, based on the known equipment configuration and the reasonable assumptions about what a competent operator could achieve with proper investment. The result sat in his chest like a stone. The price he had accepted for the property, the price he had been authorized to accept, yes, but had also advised was reasonable, represented a fraction of what the asset was now generating. He closed the browser and did not open it again that day. He did not bring it to Evelyn's attention. Kara Whitfield, working separately and more carefully, traced the same path and arrived at a different response. She searched the Callaway Industrial name in combination with the Westbrook facility and the known transaction date. She found the public filing and Mason Callaway's name as managing director. She sat with that for a moment, then typed his name into a separate search, adding the word Vantex. The results that came back were not surprising in the way unexpected information surprises. They were surprising in the way that something you should have known all along surprises. The lurch of recognition that arrives a beat too late. 7 patents. 11 years of systems engineering at a firm whose clients included, among many others, Hargrove Industrial. She printed the relevant pages, collated them with the Westbrook transaction record, and placed them in a folder on her desk. She sat looking at that folder for a while before she picked up her pen and wrote Mason Callaway's name on the tab in her neat, unhurried hand. She did not go to Jason. She understood, with the clarity that comes from 4 years of watching what happened to information that went through Jason before it reached Evelyn, that this particular folder needed to travel a different route. She waited for the right moment to take it to Evelyn directly. That moment came on a Thursday evening when the 2 of them were working late, as they often did at the end of the quarter. Evelyn reviewing reports at the conference table, Kara handling correspondence nearby. Kara placed the folder on the table beside Evelyn's water glass without comment. Evelyn looked at her, then down at the folder, then opened it. She read the first page slowly, then the second, then the patent list. She went back to the photograph on the first page, a professional headshot from a Vantex profile that was 6 years old, showing a man in a dark jacket looking directly into the camera with the composed, unguarded expression of someone who had nothing to perform. Evelyn recognized the face. She recognized the posture. She recognized the exact quality of stillness. The man who had walked into her facility carrying a worn tool bag. The man whose work had restarted a production line she had been told could not be restarted. The man she had thanked for handling a small matter. She closed the folder and held very still for a moment. Then she asked Kara how long ago the Westbrook acquisition had closed. Kara told her. Evelyn did not say anything more that evening. The audit that followed was Evelyn's decision, made without announcement and framed to the board as a routine operational review. Kara was assigned to support the audit team, which meant she had access to the full documentation trail around Jason Merritt's management of the Westbrook disposition process. The trail was not clean. The property valuation Jason had accepted and recommended to the board had not been supported by an independent assessment. The risk flags in the due diligence file were sparse, in a way that suggested they had not been fully completed, and there was a section of the file related to the buyer's background where the verification field was blank. It was a procedural failure, compounded by a reporting failure, the second being worse than the first because it had been ongoing and deliberate. The audit team presented their findings in a document that was thorough and, in its thoroughness, unambiguous. Jason Merritt submitted his resignation 4 days before the findings were formally presented to the board. He submitted it quietly, by email, with a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities. Evelyn accepted it without response. She sat alone in the conference room after the last board member filed out. The window on the far wall looked west, toward Westbrook, though the building itself was not visible from this distance. She pulled the folder Kara had given her out of her briefcase and set it on the table again. She had read it 3 more times since that Thursday evening, not because she was learning new information, but because she was doing something harder, which was revising the stories she had told herself about the man whose shop she had laughed at, whose fee she had processed without looking up, whose capability she had summarized in the word small and not thought about again until a trade publication forced her to. She found Mason Calloway's phone number through David Keene's office, which took 1 call and no particular difficulty because Mason had not hidden himself. He had simply never been asked. He answered on the second ring. She said her name. There was a pause that was not awkward, only genuine, the pause of a person who is deciding how to respond rather than whether to respond. He said hello. She said she would like to meet and discuss a potential supply arrangement. He said he was available Tuesday morning. She asked where would work for him. He said, the shop on Calloway. She said she would be there at 9. He arrived alone. No assistant, no driver, no documents under her arm. She had not been in the shop before she had stood at the entrance that first day and not come in. Inside, she saw it differently than she would have seen it that day. The ordered tools, the clean benches, the framed photograph on the back wall, a group of engineers in front of a completed production facility, Mason younger by a decade, and standing second from the left, and on the corner of the main workbench, a small white stuffed rabbit with button eyes, and one ear slightly more worn than the other. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. There was something disorienting about standing in this room, after standing in her own offices for so long, something about the scale and the material honesty of the space that made the language she normally relied on feel poorly fitted to the occasion. Mason came through the back door with 2 mugs of coffee, set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and sat on the stool across the bench. She wrapped her hands around the mug and said what she had come to say first, that she had reviewed his background and understood now who she had been working with, and that she wanted to discuss a long-term supply agreement for precision components. Mason listened to the full shape of her proposal. Then he said that he appreciated her directness. Then he said one other thing, not sharply, not as an accusation, but as a plain statement. Do you remember that afternoon at Facility 2? She looked at him. He said he didn't need anything from her about it. He said that what happened that day was what it was, and he hadn't lost sleep over it, but he wanted her to understand that the shop was real and the work was real, and he had never been ashamed of either. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not offer the easy apology that would have ended the moment quickly. She said she understood that now. It was not the same thing as an apology, and they both knew it, but it was something more specific than an apology, which was an honest acknowledgement made directly to the person it was owed to. She pushed a folder across the bench. He looked at the cover, did not open it. She said, "Take whatever time you need to review the terms." He said he would. She stood to go, picking up her coat from the second stool where she had draped it. At the door, she turned and looked at the sign above the entrance, the hand-lettered name that had rusted at the corners and that she had laughed at once in a voice meant to be heard. She did not laugh now. She read it as information, plain and accurate, the name of the man and the place where he worked, neither more nor less than that. Adrian stopped by the shop that evening and found Mason at the bench with the folder open, reading through the supply agreement terms with the deliberate care he brought to any document that carried consequences. Adrian set a coffee on the corner of the bench beside Cotton and asked what he was looking at. Mason said Hargrove wants a supply arrangement. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Are you going to do it?" Mason said he was thinking about it. Adrian said, "3 months ago that would have been a strange thing for you to say." Mason turned to Paige and said, "3 months ago I wasn't ready to ask whether she was worth working with. Now I am. That's different." Adrian picked up his coffee and said nothing more, which was his way of indicating that he understood the distinction completely. 3 weeks later, Mason signed the agreement. Not because he needed the contract. Callaway Industrial had enough to sustain itself and grow on its own terms. He signed it because the terms were fair and the product would be used well, and because, as he told David Keene when they reviewed the final document together, good work ought to go where it can do the most. David had looked at him over his reading glasses and said that was an unusual reason for a business decision. Mason said he had made unusual decisions before, and most of them had worked out. The shop sign came down on a Saturday morning. Mason did it himself, up on a ladder with a socket set, unbolting the old bracket from the fascia board, while Bonnie stood below in her jacket, holding cotton and watching. When the old sign was off, she asked what the new one was going to say. Mason climbed down and stood beside her, looking at the clean rectangle of exposed brick where the old sign had been. He said, "Just Callaway." Bonnie thought about that and nodded with the grave consideration that 6-year-olds apply to decisions they have been included in. The new sign went up that afternoon, clean and flat and simple. One word in dark letters. No descriptor, no qualifier. The name had always been enough. It had just taken the world a while to read it correctly. In the kind of city where people move fast and judge by surface, the story of Mason Callaway was not a story that would ever be told loudly. No profile, no profile photograph, no origin narrative republished on the platforms where such stories were usually performed. The trade publications mentioned Callaway Industrial occasionally, when a contract was significant enough to note. The number of people who knew the full arc of what had happened could have fit in the front room of the shop. But in the world where precision and patience and the willingness to work without an audience determined what lasted, Mason Callaway had built something that would still be running long after the names on the Hargrove letterhead had changed several times over. He had done it without announcement and without revenge, because those were not the tools he worked with. He had done it the same way he fixed the machine that day, quietly, correctly, completely. And when the work was finished, he turned off the light and went home to his daughter.